25 One Piece theories that turned out to be true. Theory number 1, Kaido had the dragon fruit. As for the first theory that turned out to be correct, the one they got right was that Kaido had the dragon fruit. And to start off on the right foot, let's go with a theory that, for those who experienced it in real time, was one of the most satisfying to witness in the entire recent history of One Piece. And that is that long before we reached Wano, there was a question that lingered in the minds of fans. What devil fruit would Kaido exactly have? The answer that ultimately turned out to be the Uo Uo no Mi model Seiryu, technically a mythical dragon and not just any dragon, though we all know what we mean, had been pointed to for years as the most widespread theory in the community. And for good reason, because the hints Oda had been leaving were surprisingly clear if you knew where to look. But where exactly did this theory come from? It didn't emerge from nowhere or from the wild imagination of someone with too much free time. It arose fundamentally from the dialogue and behavior of Momonosuke. And this is where things get interesting, because Momonosuke is a character who, from the moment we meet him in the Punk Hazard arc, displays a series of notably strange behaviors. The most striking of all was his fear of heights. At first glance, it could seem like just a character trait, something anecdotal, but the more attentive fans started to pull on that thread, and wondered why exactly a boy from the Kozuki family, with all the historical weight that entails, had that particular fear. Over time, it was revealed that this fear came directly from having been grabbed by the neck by Kaido in front of the palace, which already gave us a clue about the direct relationship between Momonosuke and the Yonko. But that wasn't all. The detail that ultimately gave shape to the theory came when Momonosuke transformed into a dragon. At that moment, the character displays a very clear aversion to dragons, almost as if they produced visceral disgust or hatred in him. Kinemon also mentions that feeling, speaking of dragons in a way that made it clear there was something behind that hatred, something deeper than simple aesthetic repulsion. And of course, when fans already knew that Momonosuke's father, Kozuki Oden, had been killed by Kaido, 2 plus 2 started adding up to 4 in a rather compelling way. The logic was simple but powerful. If Momonosuke hated dragons with that intensity, and if the person who had killed his father was precisely Kaido, then it was very likely that Kaido was a dragon. It wasn't a theory based on empty speculation or nonsense. It was a theory built on real clues that Oda had planted very carefully from the very first moments of the New World section. This kind of foreshadowing is exactly what makes reading One Piece week by week such a special experience for those who enjoy following the work so closely. What makes this theory especially beautiful is that Oda didn't try to hide it behind layers and layers of mystery. The clues were already there, visible for anyone who wanted to see them. And this demonstrates enormous confidence from the author in his own reader. Oda knew that people were going to figure it out, and yet he decided that what mattered was not the twist itself, but the emotional impact of seeing it confirmed. And in that sense, when we finally arrived at Wano and Kaido was revealed as the dragon everyone expected, the satisfaction was not that of discovering something surprising, but of having confirmed something you had built piece by piece over the years. That is a feeling very few works are capable of generating. In short, this first theory is the perfect example of how the theorizing process should work within a work like One Piece, starting from real clues, building solid arguments, and reaching conclusions the author had already had in mind from the beginning. It wasn't luck or coincidence, it was following Oda's footsteps carefully, and that deserves a lot of credit. And now that you've perfectly understood what this video is about, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Let's continue. Theory number 2, Shanks had a twin brother. If there is a theory that was built up gradually, accumulating piece after piece until it became practically inevitable, it is the one about Shanks's twin brother. For years, this idea had been circulating in the community, generating debates, being dismissed by many and firmly defended by others. And it was finally confirmed, and it happened in a way that showed the clues had been there all along, waiting to be connected. The first clue that set this theory in motion was one of the most confusing and debated of recent years. A character appeared in the community who looked enormously like Shanks, but who was having a conversation with the Gorosei. At that moment, the most logical thing for most people was to assume directly that it was Shanks, and from there arose a theory that had quite a following for a time. The theory that Shanks was a traitor, the idea that Shanks might be working in some way with the world government. However, However, over time it became clear that this was not the case, and that figure was not the Shanks everyone knew. This initial confusion was, paradoxically, the first major clue that there was another character who resembled him very closely. The second clue came with the introduction of the Divine Knights. Among their members was a figure visually very similar to Shanks, which again set off alarms in the community. Over time, it was revealed that this character was Figurland Garling, and that he had a direct connection to Shanks. The conclusion most people drew was that Garling was practically Shanks' father, which added an enormous layer of complexity to the character and the world he came from. It was precisely following the appearance of the Divine Knights that another theory emerged that had a lot to do with all of this. The idea that the Divine Knights represented the signs of the zodiac. This theory, originating in the English-speaking community, also reached the Spanish-speaking community and pointed out that one of the Divine Knights could represent Gemini, and Gemini, of course, is the sign of twins. That connection, although it might have seemed forced at first, fit perfectly with what was already being considered about the existence of a second Shanks in the story. The third clue came during the message that Vegapunk broadcast to the world. In that crucial moment for the plot, the silhouettes of several characters could be seen in the background, and among them was one that looked very much like Shanks. It was just a silhouette without specific details, but by then there were already too many accumulated coincidences to ignore. The physical resemblance, the connection to the Divine Knights, the Gemini sign, the character confused with Shanks talking to the Gorosei, everything pointed in the same direction. And finally, it was confirmed. Shanks has a twin brother, and that brother turned out to be a commander among the Divine Knights. For those who had been closely following all of these clues, the confirmation wasn't exactly a surprise, but rather the feeling that everything fit together exactly as it should. For those who hadn't followed it so closely, it was a twist that completely redefined the story and background of one of the most mysterious characters in the work. Either way, it was a huge moment, and the theory that predicted it deserves all the recognition. Theory number 3. Saul was alive. There are theories that are born with the community's support behind them, backed by general consensus and received with enthusiasm from the very first moment. And then there are theories like the one about Saul. This is one of those theories that swam against the current from the beginning, that had to survive the laughter, the skepticism, and the widespread conviction that it was wrong, only to end up being, with the passage of time, one of the most emotionally resonant confirmations One Piece has given in recent years. Saul is a character who carries enormous weight in Robin's story, and that is precisely why his supposed death on Ohara is so impactful. We see him fall during the Buster Call, frozen by Aokiji, and the scene is constructed in a way that clearly invites you to think this is the end of the character. The narrative pushes you toward that conclusion, the emotional context reinforces it, and for many years most fans assumed without question that Saul had died on Ohara. But there were those who didn't accept that. There were those who, going back over those pages with more critical eyes, began to see things that didn't quite add up. Details in the manga that opened up the possibility, however small, that Saul hadn't died. Arguments that went against the consensus but had a real basis to build on. And it was in that context that a voice rose in the Spanish-speaking community to defend this theory when practically no one else was doing so. The initial reaction was what any theory that challenges what the majority takes for granted usually receives: mockery, immediate dismissal, and the conviction that whoever defended it was being carried away by wishful thinking rather than a real analysis of the work. It was said that it was an impossible theory, that Saul had clearly died, that these things didn't happen in One Piece. And yet, over time, exactly that happened. Saul was alive. The confirmation came some years ago, and when it did, it was a moment of satisfaction that is difficult to describe. Not just for the narrative fact itself, which is enormous, as seeing Saul alive has beautiful implications for Robin's arc and for the story of Ohara in general, but for what it represents for those who defended the theory when no one else would. There is something very special about going against the current, arguing with conviction, and ultimately being proven right, especially when the majority had laughed at that idea. What makes this theory especially valuable, beyond the outcome, is that it demonstrates something important about how One Piece works. Oda has his stories planned out in much more detail than he sometimes lets on, and characters that seem dead are not always so, especially when their story still has unresolved threads. The case of Saul is a reminder that it's worth not closing the book on anything too soon in this work, because Oda always has something up his sleeve. Theory number 4. Scapper Gaban would appear in Elbaf. This is a theory that was confirmed at the very last moment, literally. Its confirmation came in chapter 1139 of the manga, which makes it one of the most recent on this list. But that doesn't mean it's a new theory. On the contrary, it's something fans had been predicting for quite some time, and it gained particular strength once it became clear that certain characters weren't going to appear in the more recent arcs. Scapper Gaban is one of those characters who's been hovering over the work for years without fully materializing. We know he was one of the crew members of Roger's pirates. We know he was there during some of the most important moments of the golden age of piracy, and yet his direct presence in the current plot has been conspicuously absent for a very long time. Fans had been asking for years when, and above all, where he was going to appear. The theory that Gaban would be an Elbaf began to gain traction, especially after the Wano arc. In this long and content-dense arc with so many characters and subplots, Scapper Gaban didn't appear. And of course, when that happens with a character of this weight, the community starts calculating. If he didn't appear in Wano and the islands we still have to visit are getting fewer, where could a character of such importance appear? The logical answer was Elbaf, because it's the island that has been pointing for years to being one of the most important settings in the entire final stretch of the series. The reasoning behind the theory made a lot of sense. Characters of top-tier importance connected to the Pirate King story and to the Golden Age cannot appear just anywhere. They need a setting worthy of them, a moment that justifies the weight they carry in the story, and Elbaf, with everything that had been built around it, fit perfectly as the place where a character like Scapper Gaban would have to reappear. Additionally, the precedent of Rayleigh was an extra argument. If Roger's right-hand man had appeared, it made sense to think Gaban would too at some relevant moment. The confirmation finally came, and with Scapper Gaban's appearance, a small running joke was born on the channel. When they introduced Scapper Gaban, they called him Gusan, so I made the joke that maybe he could be Scapper Gaban's brother and not the original. I obviously said this as a joke in the style of a Sogeking reference, but many people took it seriously. Some saying what I said made no sense, and others actually believing it had logic to it, which is why I personally always hold this theory with a special fondness. Beyond the anecdote, the confirmation of this theory is good news for Scapper Gaban fans, who finally see this historic character making an appearance in the current plot. It's also good news for the narrative, because his appearance in Elbaf reinforces the importance of that island as a key setting in the final stretch of the series. Theory number 5. The flaw in Momonosuke's artificial fruit was the color. This is probably the most curious theory on the entire list. Not because it predicted a major plot twist or revealed something fundamental about the story of One Piece, but precisely the opposite. Because what it predicted was so apparently insignificant, so small, so silly according to many, that the fact that it turned out to be true makes it one of the most fascinating examples of fans sometimes being able to read Oda's minds better than they themselves expect. It all starts in Punk Hazard. Momonosuke, hungry and lost in Vegapunk's facilities, consumes what turns out to be an artificial fruit created by Vegapunk himself, a version of the Uo Uo no Mi, the same fruit that Kaido has. But at that moment, it's made clear that this fruit has a flaw, that it was a failed experiment, and that therefore Momonosuke, having consumed it, would also carry that flaw in some way. That said, the problem was that no one really knew what the flaw was. And over time, the more we saw Momonosuke use his dragon form, the less clear the error seemed to be. Momo's dragon generated the same clouds as Kaido, even managed to breathe fire. He could fly. When Momonosuke grew, his dragon form grew with him too. In functional terms, there seemed to be no apparent difference between the artificial fruit and the original. The dragon did everything a dragon in One Piece is supposed to do. Then came the theory that at first generated quite a bit of skepticism. The flaw wasn't functional. It was aesthetic. The flaw was simply that Momonosuke's dragon was pink instead of the blue that Kaido had. Nothing more. That was all. Vegapunk's error was that the color had come out wrong. For many fans, this sounded like a joke, like filler theory, something too trivial to be real. It didn't make sense that the great flaw of a revolutionary artificial fruit would simply be the color. But the theory had a solid argument behind it, and that argument had to do with Vegapunk's personality. To understand why color could be considered a flaw, you have to understand who Vegapunk is. An absolutely perfectionist scientist, obsessed with precision, with reproducing things exactly as they should be. For someone with that level of self-demand, a fruit that works correctly but doesn't replicate the original color with accuracy isn't a success, it's a failure. It's an imperfect copy. And for Vegapunk, imperfect copies are not acceptable. The confirmation came in the Egghead arc. Someone asks Vegapunk about Momonosuke's fruit, and Vegapunk asks if the dragon was pink. They confirm it is, and Vegapunk's reaction is exactly what the theory had predicted. He says it's a huge error, an unacceptable failure, demonstrating all of his perfectionism in a single response. The flaw was nothing that affected the use of the fruit, it was simply that the color wasn't correct, and for Vegapunk, that was enough to consider the experiment a failure. The theory, as silly as it sounded at first, had perfectly read both the logic of the fruit and the psychology of the character. Theory number 6. Buggy would become a Yonko. There are theories that are born from deep analysis of the work, from hours studying the manga, from connecting subtle clues that Oda has left with mastery. And then there's the Buggy Yonko theory, which was basically born as a meme. And what makes this theory so special is that despite that, it turned out to be completely true. The meme became a theory, and the theory became reality, which is, if you think about it, probably the most buggy thing that could have happened to a theory about Buggy. And an interesting fact about this theory is that on the channel we discussed quite seriously that after the Wano arc, Buggy would end up becoming an Emperor of the Sea, a Yonko, something that ultimately happened. It's one of the theories I hold most dearly, obviously not only because I got it right, but because it was something too crazy that I said with arguments and completely seriously, and above all because of how crazy it is that Buggy ended up becoming a Yonko. To understand why this started as a joke, you have to remember how Buggy became a Shichibukai. It wasn't because of his combat skills, which are quite limited by the series standards. It wasn't because of his strategic influence or any elaborate plan either. It was basically a chain of misunderstandings, absurd strokes of luck, and the involuntary charisma of a guy who has the gift of landing on his feet in situations that would kill anyone else. Buggy became a Shichibukai the same way Buggy does everything, by accident and by luck. It was precisely that trajectory that led fans to joke that following that same logic, Buggy could end up becoming a Yonko. The idea was absurd on the surface, a comic exaggeration of the joke that Buggy's position as a figure of power already was. People said it half joking, half commenting on how ridiculously the character's accidental rise had gone. Haha, Buggy Yonko. Haha, Buggy will be a Yonko. That was the level of debate when this was discussed. But there's something interesting about how the One Piece community works. Sometimes jokes have more substance than they appear to, because beneath the laughter there was a real observation. Buggy had an organization. He had subordinates who followed him blindly without quite understanding why. He had a reputation inflated by the legend of having belonged to the crew of the Pirate King, Gol D. Roger. And he had luck that defied all logic. This isn't so different from what characterizes many of the great powers in the world of One Piece. That's how the joke began to be taken more and more seriously in certain circles, to the point where it was given the shape of a real theory and published as such. The reaction was varied. Some saw it as a legitimate bet, and some kept thinking it was a joke with a different rapper. But the theory was there, written, published, and defended with arguments. At the end of the Wano arc came the confirmation. Buggy had become a Yonko. What had started as a meme had become reality, and the community's reaction was a perfect mix of laughter and genuine amazement. Even now, people talk about Buggy as Pirate King as if it were a real possibility, which says a lot about the point the character has reached. This theory is the purest example that in One Piece, and with Buggy, anything is possible, and that sometimes jokes have more insight than they appear to. Theory number 7. Lola is Big Mom's daughter. Thriller Bark is an arc that many remember with a certain ambivalence. It's true that narratively it's not one of the densest in the series, that the pacing is different, and that there are moments where the story seems to take more time than necessary. But it has something that makes it especially interesting for fans who enjoy finding clues in the details. At the end of the arc, in a moment that could seem secondary, Oda plants one of the clearest and most elegant pieces of foreshadowing in the entire series. The scene is as follows. Before the Straw Hats leave Thriller Bark, Lola says goodbye to Nami and gives her a Vivre card, explaining that the card belongs to her mother, an incredibly powerful pirate, and says that if they ever reach the New World and meet her, they should show her the card and tell her Lola gave it to them, because she would surely help them. It's an emotional farewell scene with an enormous weight of trust on Lola's part, leaving them in the hands of her mother as if that were the best guarantee of safety one could have. The problem that Lola obviously doesn't mention is that the relationship with her mother wasn't exactly the smoothest, but that would come later. At that moment, what mattered was that fans had a concrete piece of information. Lola's mother was a very powerful pirate operating in the New World, and fans who were paying close attention also knew that in the New World there was a pirate of immense power, one of the 4 Yonko, Big Mom. From there, the theory was almost inevitable. 2 + 2 = 4. The theory circulated through the community for a long time, gaining followers as the arcs passed and more information about Big Mom was revealed. One of the things that helped reinforce the theory was precisely Big Mom's physical design. When we finally saw her in more detail, fans pointed to similarities between Charlotte Linlin and Lola in certain features: the hair, the lips, some facial details. They weren't definitive proof, but they added to the set of arguments pointing in the same direction. And over time, when we finally arrived at the Whole Cake Island arc and the entire story of the Charlotte family unfolded before us, the confirmation came: Lola was indeed Big Mom's daughter. What makes this foreshadowing especially elegant is the period of time that passed between the clue and the confirmation. We're not talking about chapters, but years of publication. The fact that fans were able to read this clue correctly so far in advance speaks both to the clarity with which Oda planted it and to the community's ability to keep up with him. It's one of those cases where theory and narrative work in perfect harmony. Theory number 8. X-Drake was a Marine spy. And yes, I know his real name is X-Drake, but I've always called him XD, so I'll use that. X-Drake is a character who, from his introduction in the series, generated a lot of interest precisely because of what seemed to not quite fit him. A Marine who becomes a pirate, who is part of the worst generation, and who ends up integrating into Kaido's forces in Wano. On the surface, his story is that of someone who left the Marines behind to pursue his own goals as a pirate. But fans who paid close attention to the details of his past started to see that maybe things weren't so simple. The key was in his father. X-Drake's father had also had a close relationship with the Marines, with a role that bore certain similarities to the double life that fans began to theorize for Drake himself. The parallel between father and son was too obvious to ignore. If the father had had that particular relationship with the Marines, and if the son was following an apparently similar path through piracy, wasn't it possible that the son was doing exactly the same thing as the father, just with more discretion? The theory began to take shape. X-Drake hadn't really abandoned the Marines, he had pretended to. His pirate career was a cover, an infiltration, a long-term undercover operation designed to gather information from within the circles of the most powerful pirates. The fact that he had ended up integrating into Kaido's forces, one of the 4 emperors, one of the most feared in the world, made that cover especially valuable from the Marines' point of view. Over time, and with more chapters accumulated, the theory gained weight. Drake's behavior, certain decisions he made, and certain moments where he seemed not to quite fit the role of ruthless pirate he was supposedly playing, all of it started to make more sense read from the perspective of someone who was, at heart, still a Marine agent. And finally, in the Wano arc, the confirmation came. X-Drake was indeed a spy. What is most interesting about this confirmation, however, is not just the fact that the theory was correct, but what came after. Or rather, what didn't come after. Because the revelation that Drake was a Marine spy opened the door to an entire series of enormous narrative possibilities. The Marines acting from within, undercover operations with consequences for the outcome of the conflict in Wano, Drake's role as a connecting element between the pirates and the world government. And yet none of that ended up being developed with the depth it deserved. The Marines didn't participate in a significant way in the resolution of the Kaido conflict, and Drake's role as a spy didn't have the impact the theory promised. It's one of those cases where the theory was more ambitious than the narrative execution, which generates a bittersweet feeling. The clue was good, the parallel with the father was very well constructed, and Oda planted foreshadowing in a way that justified the revelation. But the potential of what that storyline could have been wasn't fully realized. Even so, the theory deserves its place on this list because the logic with which it was built was solid, and Oda's foreshadowing, though underused, was real. Theory number 9. Sanji has a noble lineage. If there is a character in One Piece whose past was the subject of intense speculation for years, it's Sanji. From relatively early in the series, small details began to accumulate that didn't quite fit the image of ship's cook that the character projected on the surface. Details that on their own could seem like simple character traits or comedic touches, but when viewed together began to suggest that there was something more behind Sanji's story, something related to a more complex and perhaps more important origin than it seemed. The first clue many point to comes from the Alabasta arc. At that moment, Sanji adopts the alias Mr. Prince to throw Baroque Works off. And although in the immediate context it's simply a tactic, the choice of that particular alias is not random for those who were paying attention. Prince is not an alias that just anyone would choose at random, and the way Sanji uses it, with an ease that almost seems instinctive, started making some wonder whether that title had some kind of personal resonance for the character. The second clue, perhaps more explicit, arrived in Thriller Bark. In that arc where Kuma confronts the Straw Hats, there's a moment where he makes a very specific reference to Sanji, pointing to him as someone who will be very important, someone whose identity, if revealed, would endanger many people or have enormous consequences. It's a line that feels cryptic in the moment, but in retrospect is one of the most direct pieces of foreshadowing that Oda planted about Sanji's past, as it gave the character a completely different weight. As the series progressed, other elements added up. Sanji's connection to Germa 66, which gradually emerged, began to give shape to the idea that the Sunny's cook didn't come from a humble and anonymous background, but from something far more elaborate. When we finally arrived at the Whole Cake Island arc and the full truth about Sanji's past was revealed, the theory was confirmed. Sanji was a member of the Vinsmoke royal family. The Vinsmokes were not celestial dragons or world government nobles, but they were a family with a kingdom and a history that placed them in a very particular position of power within the world of One Piece. The boy everyone knew as the cook who only fought with his legs had an origin directly connected to royalty and to the genetic science of human modification. This theory is one of the best examples of Oda's foreshadowing, because it demonstrates that the author had Sanji's past planned practically from the beginning of the series. The clues in Alabasta, in Thriller Bark, the visual details, and the cryptic dialogues were all part of a plan that took years to fully develop. And the fact that fans were able to follow this thread and reach the right conclusion is a testament both to Oda's narrative consistency and to the community's perceptiveness. Theory number 10. Sabo was alive. To close this section, we arrive at a theory that could generate some debate. Not because it's difficult to understand or because its implications are complex, but because it touches on a sensitive point in the relationship between fans and the way Oda handles certain narrative elements. The theory that Sabo was alive is in its own nature much simpler than the others we've seen, but the context in which it's raised and what it reveals about One Piece make it a mandatory entry on any list of theories that turned out to be true. The theory doesn't start at the moment we see the famous Vivre card cover page with the 3 sake cups, though it's true that image was one of the most direct clues that reinforced the idea. The theory begins much earlier, directly during the flashback of Luffy's past. At that moment, when the ship on which Sabo was traveling is destroyed by the Celestial Dragon, the scene is constructed in such a way that the natural conclusion is the character's death. It's an impactful death that serves as a formative trauma for Luffy and Ace and carries all the emotional weight necessary to function as the defining moment the narrative wants it to be. However, there was someone who from that moment wasn't entirely convinced. There was something in the way the scene was constructed, something in the details of how what happened to Sabo was shown that left a door slightly ajar. The possibility that someone had rescued him, that someone had intervened in time, or that the death wasn't as final as it seemed. It was a reading that went against the majority interpretation, but had some basis in what the manga showed. The cover page with the 3 sake cups came to add another layer of ambiguity. In that image, we see 3 sake cups and the graves of Whitebeard and Ace, and many interpreted this as a direct reference to Luffy's past and the possibility that a 3rd Sake brother was still alive. It was one of those cryptic clues that Oda uses to say something without saying it explicitly, and it worked perfectly as a reinforcement of the theory. Over time, the confirmation came. Sabo was alive. He had been rescued and had an entire history behind him that the work needed to tell. For those who had predicted it, it was a moment of satisfaction. For those who hadn't expected it, It was a surprise that opened up enormous new narrative possibilities. But here comes the point that this confirmation also puts on the table, and it's a legitimate criticism of Oda. The theme of fake deaths in One Piece has become such a recognizable pattern that it has ended up eroding the credibility of any death in the series. When they supposedly kill Kinemon in Wano, for example, my reaction was to believe he wasn't dead. It seemed like a very poor death for the kind of character Kinemon was, and I was convinced Oda would find a way for him to be alive. I remember that at that moment, many people laughed at me saying I was crazy, and it ultimately turned out to be the case. The problem is that when deaths stop being believable, narrative tension dissipates. One Piece is approaching its final stretch, and if the audience no longer believes any death because their accumulated experience tells them no one really dies, that has consequences for the emotional experience of reading. Just a small reflection I wanted to share before moving on to the next confirmed theory. But let me know what you think about that in the comments. Let's continue. Theory number 11. The mysterious Marine with the dog helmet was Luffy's grandfather. This theory is interesting because it mixes something very concrete from the canon with the historical memory of the fandom. It's not a theory about the future of the work, but about how some readers managed to get ahead of a small revelation that Oda wanted to present as a surprise: that the mysterious Marine with the dog helmet was Luffy's grandfather. Let's break it down. In the manga, we don't see Garp's face until after the events of Enies Lobby. After the defeat of CP9, this enormous vice admiral appears wearing a dog helmet that completely covers his head. For several chapters, his face remains hidden. This is already strange in One Piece because Oda doesn't usually hide the design of an important character without a reason. When he finally takes off the helmet, we don't just see his face, he also drops the bomb. It's Monkey D. Garp, Luffy's grandfather. At the time, it was a powerful twist. Until then, we knew practically nothing about Luffy's family beyond the fact that he had grown up with Dadan and that Shanks had marked his childhood. Suddenly, we discover that his grandfather is a hero of the Marines, which completely reconfigures the narrative. But here comes the key detail. Before One Piece existed as a serialized series in Weekly Shonen Jump, Ichiro Oda published a one-shot called Romance Dawn in 1996. Surely many people watching this weren't even born yet, neither was I. In that early version, prototypes of characters appeared that would later evolve in the final work. Among them is a character who functions as Luffy's grandfather with a very recognizable design that would later transform into Garp. In this preliminary version, that figure wasn't a Marine, but a pirate, and fulfilled a role closer to what Shanks would end up occupying in the series, being the figure who sends Luffy out to sea and connects with the theme of the fruit. In other words, the concept of the grandfather already existed before the official serialization. So when in the regular manga, this Marine appears with a dog helmet whose face we can't see, some veteran readers remembered this one shot, and here is where the theory gained strength. The fandom started asking why Oda would hide this character's face. He had already played with the resource of hiding faces in Water 7. With CP9 members we already knew under another identity. In other words, when he doesn't show a face, there's usually a specific narrative reason. It's not done just because. If you analyze the context of that moment in the story, the options were limited. There weren't many characters with enough weight to justify that mystery. Furthermore, Luffy had never spoken about his grandfather. We knew he had family, but nothing had been developed on that front. The fact that this Marine behaves strangely around Luffy, treats him with familiarity, and has his identity hidden, that set off alarms. Some readers connected the dots: body design similar to the prototype, the resource of hiding the face, and the prior existence of the grandfather concept in Romance Dawn. The logical conclusion for part of the fandom was that this Marine had to be Luffy's grandfather, adapted to the definitive canon, and they were right. And what's interesting isn't just that they predicted it, but how they did it. It wasn't a theory pulled from nowhere. It was an exercise in editorial memory and narrative analysis. They identified a pattern in Oda's writing style, remembered material prior to the official serialization, and applied internal logic to what they were reading at that moment. From a narrative standpoint, it makes sense that the dog helmet served to delay the revelation. Though there's no explicit statement from Oda saying he did it exclusively because of the one-shot, it's evident that hiding the face increased the impact of the moment when the identity was revealed. If from the very first panel we could clearly see the resemblance to Luffy, the element of surprise would have been lesser. What makes this theory so good is not that it contradicts the canon, but that it demonstrates that the fandom can anticipate things when it knows the work and the author's track record well. Oda tried to build a dramatic presentation, but there were readers who understood the move before it was fully executed. And that honestly speaks both to Oda's planning and to the level of analysis that can be reached in the community when the right details are focused on. Theory number 12. The Gomu Gomu no Mi was not what it seemed. This theory revolves around one of the most impactful moments in the entire history of One Piece. The revelation in Wano that the Gomu Gomu no Mi was never really the Gomu Gomu no Mi. When Kaido defeats Luffy a second time on the roof of Onigashima and leaves him unconscious, Luffy's heart stops beating and yet starts again. That strange drumbeat precedes the awakening of his fruit and the appearance of Gear 5th. Shortly after, the Gorosei confirms what no one expected. The fruit that the world government had been trying to capture for centuries was not a simple rubber paramecia, but the mythical zone known as the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika. The impact was brutal. For over 1,000 chapters, we had assumed Luffy was the rubber guy. His identity, his fighting style, his physical limitations, even the comedic tone of his battles, everything was built on that foundation. And suddenly, we're told his power was not just rubber, but the power of the sun god Nika, a figure associated with liberation and smiling. It wasn't a simple power-up, it was a conceptual shift in what the fruit actually was. Now, although the majority of readers were in shock, there was a small group who had long suspected something didn't quite add up. Not so much that it was exactly Nika, that was practically impossible to predict with precision, but that the Gomu Gomu no Mi might not be what it seemed. Some theories predating Wano already suggested that the name could be hiding something bigger, or that its classification as a paramecia seemed too simple for the protagonist of such a long work so loaded with symbolism. But what were they based on? There was no direct proof, but several elements raised doubts. For example, the way Luffy used his body went far beyond stretching. From Gear 2nd and 3rd onward, he was already altering his physiology in extreme ways, accelerating blood flow, inflating bones, modifying proportions. Then came Gear 4th, where his body acquired almost cartoon-like properties, changing shape and bouncing with exaggerated elasticity. Some readers felt the versatility was too broad for an apparently basic fruit. There's also the question of the power ceiling. As the story advanced, increasingly enormous fruits appeared. Teach's darkness, Akainu's magma, Kuzan's ice, Whitebeard's earthquakes. Against all that, rubber seemed conceptually inferior. Many assumed the key with Luffy would be Haki, not his fruit, but others wondered whether Oda would really take the protagonist to the end with such a simple ability, while antagonists accumulated devastating powers. The curious thing is that the final revelation didn't make the fruit something more serious or more elemental in the classic sense. It wasn't stronger magma or a definitive bolt of lightning, it was something far stranger. Absolute freedom in combat, distorted physics, cartoon logic, what many today describe as Toon Force. And that's where the theory connects unexpectedly with what Oda said, that he chose that power because he wanted Luffy to have the most ridiculous ability in the world. In other words, those who thought the fruit was hiding something more powerful were right that a bigger twist was being prepared. But it wasn't power in the traditional sense. It was power in the sense of creative and narrative freedom. The awakening didn't just increase his strength. It redefined how his body works and how his battles are depicted. Looking at it in perspective, one of the greatest structural changes in the work. It doesn't alter the past, Luffy was always who he was, but it changes the interpretation of everything that came before. And the fact that a small percentage of the fandom smelled that the Gomu Gomu might not simply be a rubber fruit demonstrates something very interesting. That even when Oda builds a solid premise over decades, he always leaves room for someone to suspect there's another layer underneath. And when that layer is revealed, the blow is historic. Theory number 13. Monkey D. Dragon was a former Marine. This theory about Monkey D. Dragon was for years one of the most debated, above all because the character was always surrounded by mystery. We knew the basics, he's Luffy's father, Garp's son, and the leader of the Revolutionary Army, and that was practically it, almost nothing more. For someone with that weight within the world of One Piece, it was suspiciously little. The starting point of the theory was quite logical. If Garp is a Marine hero, a central figure within the institution, and we also know he's a committed Marine who even refused promotions to avoid being directly under the orders of the Celestial Dragons, it would be natural to think that his son Dragon had also had some connection to the Marines. It didn't seem far-fetched to imagine he had followed in his father's footsteps, at least during some stage of his life. Here is where the interesting part comes in. If Dragon ended up becoming the world government's most wanted man, the leader of the movement that wants to tear down the entire system, what had to happen for someone raised in the shadow of the most famous Marine to decide to go to the exact opposite extreme? That contrast was too powerful to be accidental. The theory proposed that Dragon wasn't born a revolutionary, but became one after seeing something that broke him inside. For a long time, there was no direct confirmation, just loose clues. Dragon appears in Logtown, intervenes at just the right moment to save Luffy, and disappears. Later we learn he leads an enormous organization with bases, commanders, and a global structure, but his past remained in the shadows. The fandom's reasoning was simple. To hate something so deeply that you dedicate your life to destroying it, you first have to have known it from the inside. If Dragon had been simply an outraged civilian, that would have been a possible path. But if he had been a Marine, the story gained far greater dramatic weight. It implied betrayal, ideological conflict, family rupture, and a conscious decision based on direct experience. Over time, especially with the information revealed around God Valley, the theory gained strength. We know that in that incident, key figures such as Garp and Roger were present, and that the world government covered up what happened there. Later, the manga makes it clear that Dragon had a past connected to the Marines, and that he witnessed events that led him to completely reconsider the system. Among them, the brutality of the Celestial Dragons, and the way the Marines act as the enforcers of their interests. The hardest point to understand was that this wasn't just isolated corruption, but something structural. If Dragon saw God Valley, the human hunt organized by the Celestial Dragons, the suffering of innocence, and the Marines' passivity or even complicity, that would perfectly explain his break. It wouldn't be an ideological tantrum, it would be a decision based on concrete facts. And it also fits with Garp. Garp has never been a blind defender of the world government. He believes in justice, but detests the Celestial Dragons. The fact that he can understand, though not fully share, his son's decision adds a very powerful emotional layer. It's not simply, my son has gone bad, but my son saw something that led him down another path. What's interesting is that this theory didn't arise from exaggeratedly clear clues, but from narrative coherence. Over time, Oda released information that ended up confirming the essential points. Dragon was in the Marines and deserted after witnessing atrocities that marked him deeply. The theory that was pure speculation at the time ended up becoming part of the canon. And after God Valley, the hype is at another level because we know the what, but the how and the how far still remain. How far can Monkey D. Dragon go with the entire revolutionary army? Theory number 14. Rox D. Xebec was Blackbeard's father. This theory about Rox D. Xebec was one of those that floated around for years until Oda decided to drop the bomb directly. And what's interesting isn't just the revelation itself, but how the mystery was built from the beginning. Rox was officially introduced during the Wano arc when Sengoku talks about the God Valley incident. There we're told that there existed a legendary crew made up of monsters like Kaido, Big Mom, and Whitebeard, all under the command of one Rox D. Xebec. And the most shocking part is that to defeat him, Gold D. Roger and Monkey D. Garp had to join forces. Just from that, you know we're talking about someone on another level entirely. From minute one, Oda presented him as a historical, almost mythical figure. Someone who wanted to become king of the world, who directly attacked the Celestial Dragons, and who ended up erased from official records. But there was a key detail. We never saw his face, only silhouettes, shadows, strategic framing, and in One Piece, when Oda hides a face for that long, it's not coincidence. That's where the theory was born. Many fans began to suspect that if his face wasn't being shown, it was because his design would reveal something too obvious. Either he had a clear physical resemblance to someone in the present, or his identity had a direct connection to some important current character. And if we're talking about ambitious pirates with chaotic ideology and obsessed with absolute power, there's one name that fits perfectly: Marshall D. Teach, Blackbeard. The ideological similarities were very strong, both with a brutal approach to power, both with boundless ambition. Rox wanted to dominate the world. Teach wants to become the absolute king and doesn't hesitate to betray, manipulate, or destroy. Additionally, the name Davy began to gain relevance, recalling the concept of the Davy Backfight, a pirate game that at the time seemed anecdotal but could have deeper roots.
For years, there were theories of all kinds.
That Teach inherited the will of rocks. That his ship, the Saber of Xebec, was no coincidence. That his base in Hachinosu had a direct connection to the old Rocks crew. But one of the strongest theories was that the relationship wasn't just symbolic, but blood-related. That Rocks was Blackbeard's father. The basis was simple. We had never seen Teach's father. His origin was shrouded in mystery, and his connection to ancient history was too strong to be mere coincidence. Furthermore, the narrative parallel was perfect. If Luffy is Dragon's son and Garp's grandson, a family line tied to freedom and conflict with the system, it would make a lot of sense for his main antagonist to also inherit a powerful and dark lineage. And when Oda finally showed Xebec's face, the resemblance to Teach was evident. Not subtle, not debatable, but clear. Facial features, expression, presence, and in case any doubt remained, the manga made it clear that he was Blackbeard's father, adding it in a small panel to leave no ambiguity. No beating around the bush, no hedging, direct. This is what surprised people most. Oda could have played with the mystery for longer, but chose to confirm it clearly from his full presentation, which made the entire theory that had been circulating for years explode all at once. It wasn't just an ideological connection or a metaphorical inherited will. It was literally father and son. Narratively, it's incredibly powerful. It means the final conflict isn't just Luffy versus Teach, but the continuation of a generational war. Roger and Garp against Rocks, and now Luffy, Garp's grandson, against Rocks' son. It's a historical echo that connects God Valley directly to the present, and the best part is that it demonstrates once again something very characteristic of One Piece. When Oda hides something for that long, it's not for nothing. It's because that revelation is going to reshape the entire board. This was a theory that started as a visual intuition and narrative parallel, and ended up as absolute confirmation. And when that happens, the fandom goes wild, because they realize they had correctly read the author's intention years before he confirmed it. Theory number 15. There was someone above the Gorosei. This theory has a special value for me, because it wasn't born from analyzing hidden clues, or looking for strange symbolism, or rereading chapters 20 times. It was born literally in the head of a child who had been watching One Piece since the age of 5 or 6. And that's what makes it so beautiful. When the Gorosei, the 5 elders, appear for the first time, they're introduced as the highest authority in the world. 5 men sitting in an elegant room, making decisions that affect the entire planet. At that moment, the work clearly tells you that these are the ones in charge. They are the ceiling of the system. There is no one above them, or at least that's how it seemed.
But here comes the curious part.
I, as a kid, had already internalized a narrative pattern without realizing it. Most of the series I had watched up to that point followed a very similar structure. The final big villain was almost always one. If there was a powerful group, that group answered to someone even higher. There was always a definitive figure, the final boss of the final boss. Even in video games like Pokemon, which I played a lot, there was the Elite Four, 4 brutally strong trainers, and then the champion. There was always someone higher up. It was almost an unwritten rule of the entertainment I consumed as a child. So when I first saw the Gorosei, something in my head said, okay, these seem like the ones in charge, but surely there's someone above them. It wasn't an elaborate theory. There was no proof, no panels to analyze. It was simply narrative intuition, thinking, well, this can't end here. Over the years, this idea stayed floating in my head. It wasn't something I actively defended or debated in forums. It was more of an internal feeling, like a missing piece in the puzzle. Because if the world government was the structural antagonist of the story, and the Gorosei were the visible representatives, could the entire system really rest on just 5 people at the same level? And then the moment came. Many years later, when we were already more than 2 decades into the work, when Oda reveals the existence of Imu, a completely unknown figure up to that point. A silhouette seated on the empty throne, the supposed throne that symbolized that no one governed above the world's kings, now occupied by someone. That was collective madness. The fandom exploded because not only did someone appear above the Gorosei, but it was also confirmed that the world government had been hiding the existence of an absolute sovereign for centuries. It blew my mind too. Not because I couldn't have imagined it, but because seeing it rendered in the manga is something else entirely. It's one thing to have a narrative intuition based on patterns from other stories, and quite another, after more than 1,000 chapters, to have the author confirm that there was indeed a champion above that elite. And the most striking thing isn't just that someone superior exists, it's what it implies. It means the world of One Piece is not governed by a balanced council, but by a secret figure who has been manipulating history from the shadows. It means the empty throne was a lie. It means the root of the final conflict is even deeper than it seemed. That's why I'm so attached to this theory, because it wasn't something I tried to consciously build. It was something I simply assumed as a child, applying the logic I had learned from watching other stories. And years later, when I was already creating content, making videos, and analyzing theories seriously, this idea became reality inside the manga. And it's funny how life works. You start watching One Piece as a child, you form a theory without realizing it, and years later you're talking about it on a channel and analyzing how Oda has built one of the biggest political twists in the series. Sometimes the best theories don't come from searching for hidden clues. They come from understanding how stories are told.
Theory number 16. Kanjuro was the traitor among the Red Scabbards. This theory was one of those that, when confirmed, forces you to reread half an arc with different eyes. Because the revelation that Kanjuro was the traitor wasn't simply another dramatic twist. It was a calculated move that had been cooking for years. And the most striking thing is that there were people who saw it coming. During a large part of the Wano arc, especially in the preparation for the assault on Onigashima, it's made clear that there is an infiltrator. Plans fail, locations are leaked. Orochi always seems to be one step ahead, and at one specific point, it's directly confirmed. There is a traitor among the Red Scabbards. Chaos broke out in the fandom, and practically everyone was suspected. Some pointed to Raizo because of Zou, others to Shinobu. Some even pointed to Law with more far-fetched theories. But what's interesting is that there was a fairly solid group that pointed directly to Kanjuro, and not by instinct, but by very specific details. First, there's the visual symbolism. Kanjuro has an aesthetic clearly associated with kabuki theater. Exaggerated makeup, theatrical dress, dramatic expressiveness. In Wano, theater is not simply a decorative cultural element, it's a central part of the arc. And an actor, by definition, is someone who plays a role, someone who pretends, someone who puts on a mask. Many fans began to connect this with the idea that Kanjuro was literally acting the whole time. He wasn't simply a loyal samurai, he was someone playing a role within the story. And if Oda designs characters with symbolic intent, which he does constantly, that couldn't be coincidence. But what was truly striking came with a technical detail. In Oden's flashback, when we see the Scabbards in their youth, there are scenes where Kanjuro uses his sword with one specific hand. Years later, in the present, when we see him drawing, his main ability with the Fude no Mi, he uses the other hand. That appeared on the surface to be irrelevant or even just a drawing oversight, but it wasn't, because there was another detail too. Kanjuro drew badly, very badly. His creatures were crooked, deformed, ridiculous, and everyone assumed it was just a running gag, comedic relief, the typical character who has a powerful ability but doesn't know how to use it well. But some readers started thinking, what if he doesn't draw badly because he doesn't know how? What if it's because he's using the wrong hand on purpose? And that's where everything exploded. If in the past he used the sword with one hand, and in the present he uses the other, that means he was probably hiding his true ability, voluntarily limiting himself, pretending incompetence. And this fits perfectly with the figure of the actor. When it's finally revealed that Kanjuro is the traitor, and he also demonstrates that he's actually an extremely talented artist, capable of generating complex and realistic drawings, everything makes sense. He was never clumsy, never useless. He was playing a role. And the most brilliant thing is that Oda left the clues in plain sight. It wasn't a twist pulled from nowhere, not a gratuitous shock. It had been planned for years. The theatrical makeup, the dominant hand, the exaggerated incompetence, all of it pointed in a direction that only some knew how to read. The moment of the revelation is spectacular. The panel, the expression, the open betrayal, the shift in attitude. It's one of those instances that completely redefines the character. You go from seeing him as the quirky, likable one of the group to understanding that he had been deceiving them from the very beginning. And honestly, what impresses most isn't just Oda's masterstroke, but that there were people capable of noticing something as specific as the hand he draws with. That level of analysis is obsessive in the best sense, because it proves that in One Piece, details matter, and when someone connects them ahead of time, it isn't luck. The clues were always there. Theory number 17. Zoro would have Conqueror's Haki.
This theory has been circulating practically since the Conqueror's Haki was explained as a concept within the story. And the curious thing is that for years there was no solid proof confirming anything. It was more of a mix of intuition, narrative logic, and an understanding of how One Piece works structurally. The idea was simple. Zoro would end up having Conqueror's Haki. Initially, the only confirmed member of the crew with that Haki was Luffy, and that made sense. He's the captain, the one who aspires to be king of the pirates, the one whose will bends others. Conqueror's Haki, in theory, is the Haki of those destined to stand above kings. But here's where the fandom's reasoning came in. Zoro is not just any character within the crew. He's not simply the main fighter. He's someone who lives by and for his ambition. His dream is not small. He wants to become the greatest swordsman in the world. He doesn't want to be very good. He wants to be the absolute #1. And narratively, that fits very well with the concept of king. Moreover, Zoro has always had an intimidating presence. From East Blue onward, he was already shown as someone with a brutal will, his capacity to endure pain, his discipline, his pride. All of that suggested his spirit was on a level with the great names of the world. The theory wasn't based on one specific scene where Conqueror's Haki was directly hinted at. It wasn't like when Luffy used it in Marineford and it was crystal clear. In Zoro's case, what there was narrative coherence. If the right-hand man of the future king of the pirates doesn't have a will comparable to those other greats, something feels off. There was also another important detail in the New World. We began to see that Conqueror's Haki wasn't as exclusive as it first seemed. Characters like Doflamingo, Katakuri, or even Kaido had it. In other words, it wasn't just the protagonist's Haki, but a quality shared by figures who dominate their environment. And if you look at Zoro coldly, he fits that profile perfectly. He's someone who doesn't follow Luffy out of weakness, but out of choice. He has the makings of a leader. In fact, on several occasions, he has taken on the role of making hard decisions when the captain wasn't in a condition to do so. That scene in Thriller Bark, for example, already demonstrated that his determination is at an extraordinary level. Over time, the theory gained strength. Many said it wouldn't make sense for Luffy to be the only one on the crew with that kind of immense ambition. Zoro doesn't just want to help his captain, he wants to surpass Mihawk, a figure clearly at the pinnacle of the world of swords. And finally came the confirmation, when it's revealed that Zoro can use Conqueror's Haki even before he himself is fully aware of it. All of that accumulated reasoning over the years is validated. It wasn't a gratuitous power-up, it was the natural consequence of how the character had been built from the very beginning. What's interesting is that this theory didn't need hidden clues or microscopic details like Kanjuro's. It was based on understanding the essence of the character, on knowing that someone with that ambition, that pride, and that level of determination fits perfectly within the profile of those who possess it. And when it was confirmed, it was one of those moments where the fandom wasn't so much surprised, but just knew it was a matter of time. Sometimes theories aren't about guessing something impossible. Sometimes they're simply about reading well where the story is going. Theory number 18. Ryokugyu had a plant-type fruit. This theory was one of those rare cases in One Piece where the most logical option turned out to be the correct one. And that in this work isn't as common as it might seem. When the Admiral Ryokugyu, better known as Green Bull, is first introduced during the reverie in Marijois, he isn't shown clearly, just silhouettes, partial framing, scattered dialogue, no full face, no power demonstration, no revealed fruit. Basically, total mystery. And of course, when Oda hides a character of that level to that extent, the fandom enters automatic theory mode. And there was one detail that drew enormous attention. It's mentioned that Ryokugyu hadn't eaten in years. Literally years, and that the last time he did was because a pretty girl gave him something to eat. Additionally, we see him relaxing in the sun as if he doesn't need much else. And that's where the connection started. Sunbathing plus not eating for years equals something unusual is going on here. And the theory that gained the most traction was fairly straightforward. Ryokugyu had to have some kind of fruit related to plants, perhaps a plant logia or something that let him feed through photosynthesis. It was an almost immediate conclusion for many people. If he doesn't eat but takes in sunlight, there it is, plain and simple. The curious thing is that in One Piece, we're used to the obvious option almost never being the final one. Oda usually plays at misdirection. He gives you a clear clue and then subverts it. That's why many thought the plant angle was too obvious, that surely it would be something more twisted, that maybe the not eating thing would have a different and stranger explanation. And I have to say, I included myself in that group, but the theory kept having traction for a very simple reason. It fit too well. Furthermore, Ryokugyu's own name means something like green bull. Green is the color associated with vegetation. Even from the alias itself, there was a fairly clear visual connection. Add that to the sun scene and the lack of food, and the pattern began to close. And then came the end of Wano. After Kaido and Big Mom's defeat, Green Bull appears descending from the sky, literally floating surrounded by vegetation, and starts absorbing nutrients, generating giant plants, manipulating roots and flowers. And there it was confirmed. He has a fruit related to nature, specifically the plant world. It wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't something far-fetched, it was exactly what it seemed. At that moment, an enormous number of people celebrated the correct call, because for years more complex and elaborate theories had been made, but the simplest one was the one that had made sense from the beginning. And that's what's interesting about this case. Normally in One Piece we interpret clues in the simplest way, and then Oda changes the board on us. Here it was the opposite. Oda left very clear breadcrumbs, and the fandom didn't overcomplicate it. They saw the direct connection and bet on it. Furthermore, the fruit has turned out to be very interesting at the power level, not just aesthetically, but with multiple offensive, defensive, and strategic applications. It can absorb energy, regenerate terrain, control the battlefield. It's a very versatile power, perfect for an admiral. The most curious thing is that this is one of the few examples where the dominant theory didn't need impossible mental gymnastics. You just had to connect the sun, the absence of food, and the color green. And when it was confirmed, it was one of those moments where the fandom wasn't in shock, but smiled and said, okay, this time we all saw it coming. And honestly, in One Piece, that doesn't happen every day. Theory number 19. Shanks has celestial dragon blood, the Fagarland family. This theory was, for years, one of the most controversial revolving around Shanks because it touched on something very delicate, his possible direct link to the highest power in the world. And it all started with a scene that left everyone completely disoriented at the time. When Shanks appears in Marijois and meets face to face with the Gorosei, the impact is immediate. We're not talking about a Shichibukai. We're not talking about an allied king. We're talking about one of the 4 emperors, a pirate who should be a direct enemy of the world government, walking calmly into the room of the 5 elders. And the strangest part isn't just that he enters, but how they treat him. The Gorosei say they're making an exception because it's him, because it's Shanks. That nuance changes everything. They're not negotiating with just any pirate. There's respect, there's recognition, there's something more. That's when the strong theory began. Shanks could have noble blood, could be a celestial dragon. At that moment, there was no clear proof, just that scene, the tone of the conversation, and the sense that Oda doesn't put that kind of meeting in without a reason. Some even went to the extreme and started theorizing that Shanks was a traitor, that he was secretly working for the world government or was a kind of double agent. But the most solid theory didn't go in that direction. It went toward lineage. If the government allowed him access to the core of power, there had to be a structural reason. And in One Piece, when we talk about structural privileges, we're almost always talking about blood, lineages, families with historical weight. Over the years, the clues began to fit better together. In Elbaf, we meet Shamrock, his brother, and then Fagarland Garling appears, a figure of brutal weight within the Divine Knights. From the very first moment, the physical resemblance is evident, not a coincidence, but a visual declaration. And there it was confirmed what had for so long been theory. Shanks belongs to the Fagarland family, one of the noble houses connected to the Celestial Dragons. Not only that, but his lineage is directly connected to the Divine Knights, a group that stands even above common Celestial Dragons, people with enough authority to execute one of their own if they consider it necessary, as we already saw with Garling. That elevated the theory to another level. It was no longer just that Shanks had special treatment. His origin places him at the pinnacle of world power, and that completely changed changed the reading of the character, because until then, we saw him as the free pirate par excellence, the one who inspires Luffy, the one who believes in the new generation, the balanced emperor. But now we knew his blood comes from the very heart of the system that Luffy himself is destined to destroy, and that adds a brutal narrative layer. It doesn't automatically make Shanks a traitor or a villain, but it does make him a far more complex character, someone who was born in the absolute elite of the world and chose to live as a pirate, someone who has access to the highest offices of the government but also believes in the dawn of a new era. Personally, I think it's a brilliant decision by Oda, because Shanks was already important. He was the trigger for Luffy's journey, one of the 4 Yonko, a figure respected throughout the world, but by tying him directly to the Celestial Dragons and the Divine Knights, he places him at the absolute center of the global conflict. He's no longer just a strong pirate, he's a bridge between 2 worlds. And the best part is that the clue was there from that meeting with the Gorosei. Many saw it coming, others didn't, but when it was confirmed, it wasn't a twist pulled from nowhere. It was the logical culmination of something that had been planted a long time ago. And that's what made this theory so powerful and so satisfying when it finally became canon. And to add something interesting, this video has been in production for a very long time. So long that during its production, Ichiro Oda spoke about Shanks' intervention with the Gorosei. In an SBS, Oda confirmed that the person who went to speak with the Gorosei was actually Shamrock, not Shanks, which obviously doesn't invalidate the theory. In fact, it gave it even more life, since many people had thought it could be a brother of Shanks, and ultimately it was. Theory number 20. Gol D. Roger was Porcus D. Ace's father. To talk about this theory, you have to go back very far, to a time when One Piece was still building its biggest foundations, before the time skip, before Marineford, before we knew practically anything about the true lineage of many key characters. The theory in question was that Gol D. Roger was Portkus's father. Today it sounds obvious, it's completely internalized and is part of the series' DNA. But at the time, it was a genuine narrative earthquake, because until it was officially revealed, the most logical option seemed very different. When we discover that Luffy has a father, Monkey D. Dragon, that was already a bombshell. And when we learned that Ace is Luffy's brother, the automatic conclusion everyone drew was simple. If Luffy is Dragon's son, Ace must be too. It's only natural, 2 brothers, same father. But cracks began to appear. First, Luffy's last name is Monkey D. Luffy. Ace's is Portgas D. Ace. They didn't share a last name. And in One Piece, names matter enormously. It's not something Oda leaves to chance. Second, Garp talks about Luffy as his grandson without issue, and talks about Dragon as his son, but never refers to Ace as Dragon's son. There's always a kind of distance in that regard, a strange ambiguity. Third, Ace himself never once mentions Dragon as his father. And this is striking, because if Dragon were his father, he would be an extremely relevant figure in the world. And then there's the key moment in Drum Island. Ace appears searching for Blackbeard. His presence in the country is mentioned, and it temporarily stops snowing. Then, just as we're leaving Drum Island, Dr. Kureha mentions for the first time the true name of the Pirate King, which wasn't Gold Roger, but Gol D. Roger. That detail of the D was enormous, and it coincided narratively with the consolidation of Ace as an important character. And there, some people started connecting the dots. There weren't that many characters with the D at that moment. It wasn't as widespread as it is now. If Ace had the D and his origin was mysterious, and Roger also had the D, and moreover, Ace had been introduced as an incredibly strong and charismatic pirate, the idea was already beginning to take shape. There was also a powerful thematic element, the son of the Pirate King living in the era following his death. This fit narratively in a spectacular way. It added weight, tragedy, and conflict to the character. When we finally reached Marineford and Sengoku publicly reveals that Portgas is Gol D. Roger's son, the world inside and outside the manga froze. It not only changes the perception of the character, it redefines the entire war. It's no longer just the execution of one of Whitebeard's commanders, it's the execution of the Pirate King's heir. And that's when this early theory was completely validated. What's impressive is that there were people who suspected it when there were still no direct confirmations. They were based on subtle details, the surnames, the omissions in dialogue, the handling of the D in the narrative timing in Drum Island. It was one of the first major theories that demonstrated One Piece was not simply an episodic adventure, but a story where lineages, names, and silences mattered enormously. And when it was confirmed, it wasn't just a shock. It was proof that Oda had been planting things for years that only some had known how to read.
An early, powerful, and completely true theory. Theory number 21. Trafalgar D. Waterlaw had the D in his name. This theory about Trafalgar D. Waterlaw is one of those that now seems obvious, but at the time wasn't quite so clear. And what's interesting is that it arose long before Oda officially confirmed it in Dressrosa. When the supernovas are introduced in Sabaody, we see a group of promising pirates all with very high bounties and very strong personalities. Among them, 3 clearly stand out: Luffy, Kid, and Law. From the beginning, those 3 feel like they're not on the same level as the rest. There's a special narrative quality around them. At that point, Law is introduced as Trafalgar Law, just that, with no visible D. And at that point in the story, the D was already a mysterious but important element. We knew it was carried by key characters like Luffy, Dragon, Garp, and Roger. It wasn't something Oda distributed at random. The theory began to gain traction, especially after Marineford. Law doesn't just appear there, he saves Luffy when he's on the brink of death. He picks him up in a submarine, operates on him, and literally saves his life. This is no ordinary cameo. That's directly intervening in the protagonist's fate. Many fans started thinking, this character can't simply be another strong pirate, he has to have something more. Then comes the time skip and we enter the new world. The first important island we visit is Punk Hazard, and Law is there again, not as a secondary character, but as a central piece of the conflict, as someone who already has a plan in motion, who wants to bring down Kaido, and who proposes an alliance with Luffy. This solidified his narrative relevance. At this point, people were already theorizing that Law should have a D in his full name. Why? Because his weight in the story was starting to equal Luffy's. And if Luffy represented the new generation with the will of the D, it made sense that another of the great names of the future would also carry it. Furthermore, we already knew that the world government concealed information, manipulated names, and that the D was something dangerous. It wouldn't be strange for someone to hide it voluntarily for protection, or for the government itself to have erased it from official records. The confirmation comes in Dressrosa, when his full real name is revealed: Trafalgar D. Waterlaw. There, the theory is completely validated. He wasn't just a charismatic pirate with an extremely powerful and unusual fruit. He was part of the mysterious lineage that connects to the Void Century, to Roger, to Luffy, and to the world's grand final conflict. What's interesting is that this theory wasn't based on a specific visual detail like Kanjuro's, nor on a direct clue like Ryokugyu's. It was based on narrative hierarchy, on understanding which characters were being positioned as relevant for the long term. And if you analyze it coldly, Law had too many key interventions to not be part of the core of the story. He saved Luffy, initiated the downfall of a Yonko, was directly involved in Doflamingo's defeat, and was a central piece in Wano. It's also true that for a time, there were similar theories about Kid. The parallel between Luffy, Law, and Kid was evident. 3 captains, 3 ambitious, 3 facing emperors. Many thought perhaps Kid also had a hidden D, but so far that hasn't been confirmed. In Law's case, it has. What makes this theory interesting is that it demonstrates how the fandom learned to read the narrative weight of characters. If someone has too much impact on the plot, they're probably connected to something much bigger. And with Law, that was the case. The D wasn't a last-minute addition. It was part of his identity from the beginning. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Theory number 22. The One Piece is something physical. This theory is curious because technically, we still haven't seen the One Piece in the manga, but we do know something key about it thanks to the author himself, and this already completely changes the debate. For over 1,000 chapters, the great question of the series has been the same: what is the One Piece? It's the central mystery, the engine of the story, the reason the Great Pirate Era exists. And of course, when you have a mystery that enormous for that many years, theories multiply. There were theories of all kinds: giant treasure chests full of gold, ancient weapons, complete poneglyphs with the truth of the Void Century, lost technology, and even more philosophical theories saying the One Piece wouldn't be something material, but something symbolic. And this is where the famous friendship debate enters. For years, many people feared that after 20 or 25 years of journey, the final treasure would be something like, well, the real treasure was the friends we made along the way. A more emotional than
tangible conclusion, something that might fit certain shonen series, but which for a story as ambitious as One Piece would have been for many a disappointment. But there was a group of fans who always defended the opposite, that the One Piece had to be something physical, something real, something you could touch, not necessarily a chest full of gold and nothing more, but something material that would justify the impact it had on Roger and his crew. And here comes what matters. Ichiro Oda confirmed in an interview that the One Piece would not be friendship or something symbolically empty. He clearly stated it would be something physical. He didn't reveal what it is, obviously, but made it clear it was not going to be an emotional joke after decades of story. This completely validated that theory because beyond external declarations, the manga itself was already giving clues. When we see the flashback of Roger arriving at Laugh Tale, his reaction is not that of someone who has understood a metaphor. It's the reaction of someone who has seen something concrete. He laughs, he gets emotional, he says they arrived too soon. This implies they found something tangible. Furthermore, the fact that the world government has such an interest in hiding the truth of the Void Century and in preventing anyone from reaching Laugh Tale suggests that what's there has real weight. It wouldn't be logical for a simple emotional concept to destabilize the entire world. That's why this theory had such strength even before Oda's confirmation, because narratively, it didn't make sense for a story built on the search for a legendary treasure to end in something ethereal. And the author's confirmation reassured many people. It was like saying, don't worry, you haven't invested decades in this story only for the answer to be the power of friendship and nothing more. There will be something physical, something concrete, something we can see, but this doesn't mean it won't have a symbolic component. Surely it will. In One Piece, almost everything important combines the material with the ideological, but it will be something real. Now the question isn't whether it's physical or not. The question is, what in the world is it? And the debate remains more alive than ever, because knowing it's tangible doesn't make it less mysterious. It only raises the expectation even higher. Theory number 23. The Straw Hat has a historical significance connected to Joy Boy. This theory is curious because it wasn't born from a specific clue or a particular panel. It's not like the one about Kanjuro using the wrong hand or the one about Ryokugyu taking in the sun. It's something much more organic, a feeling that built up little by little throughout the story. The Straw Hat couldn't just be an accessory. From East Blue, the hat already carries emotional weight. It's not just any object. It's Luffy's treasure. It's Shanks's promise. It's the symbol of his dream. That already gives it narrative importance, but there's an enormous difference between being important on a sentimental level and being important on a historical level. And that's where the theory begins. Even in early stages, there were people thinking, this hat is emphasized too much to just be a keepsake. It's literally the name of the crew. They're not called Luffy's pirates, they're the Straw Hats. And the entire identity of that group revolves around this object, and that makes you suspect. As the story advances and we start hearing terms like the Void Century, Joy Boy, the Will of the D, the Ancient Kingdom, the world becomes far larger than it seemed at the start. And at that point, many began to wonder if the hat might also have some link to all of this. But of course, thinking this in Alabasta, or even earlier, was almost madness. At that moment, no one knew where the story was going to scale. No one imagined we'd end up talking about a hidden sovereign like Emu, or a figure as legendary as Joy Boy. And yet, the theory floated, not as something solid, but as an intuition. The hat must have something more. And then comes the definitive blow. In Marijois, we see Emu walking through a secret chamber, and there is a giant straw hat frozen and kept like a historical relic. This is no longer symbolic, it's a direct connection to the past. And later, it's revealed that Joy Boy also wore a straw hat. There, the theory stops being an intuition and becomes practically a fact. The hat is a symbol that spans centuries. It's not just Shanks's keepsake, it's a historical legacy, and this completely changes its meaning. What started as a promise between a pirate and a child becomes a symbol of the world's dawn. The Straw Hat stops being merely Luffy's dream and becomes connected to the Void Century, the fall of the Ancient Kingdom, and the final conflict against the world government. What's most impressive is that this theory could have been born at any moment. You didn't need a specific scene to suspect it. All it took was noticing how much emphasis Oda put on the object. Every time the hat was damaged, the scene carried weight. Every time someone touched it, there was tension. Every time Luffy left it in someone's hands, it was significant. And that's not accidental. What is certainly true is that no one, or almost no one, in East Blue could have imagined that this hat would be linked to Joy Boy and to the heart of global mystery. history. Intuiting it would be important is one thing. Imagining it would be a key to the global plot is something completely different. That's why this theory is so interesting, because it was born from the reader's instinct of noticing that an object receives too much attention to be purely aesthetic. And today, knowing everything we know, we can say without fear that this theory was right. The hat is not just a personal symbol, it's a historical symbol. Theory number 24. Gear 5th would be the awakening of Luffy's fruit. The theory of Gear 5th was, for years, one of the biggest debates within the fandom, even before it officially existed, because from the moment we saw Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd in Enies Lobby, it was clear that Luffy had a marked progression. Then came Gear 4th with its different forms, and automatically the question began to float, would there be a Gear 5th? When we entered Wano, that suspicion intensified enormously. Luffy was about to face Kaido, the strongest creature in the world, and he was no ordinary enemy. He was a Yonko, and we had seen how Gear 4th had fairly clear limits. Against Doflamingo, it worked. Against Katakuri, it was pushed to the extreme, but worked. Against Kaido, however, it wasn't enough at first. And there the bombardment of theories began. There was everything. People saying Gear 5th would be an evolution of Gear 4th. Others saying it would be a definitive combination of advanced Haki with the rubber. Some thought it would be a more serious, darker transformation. Something completely different from Luffy's usual cartoon-like tone. And then there was a specific branch saying something very specific, that Gear 5th would be the awakening of his fruit. And this theory obviously didn't come from nowhere. We had already seen awakenings in action. Doflamingo could turn the environment into strings. Katakuri did the same with Mochi. It was explained that awakening allowed the user's ability to affect the environment, not just their own body. And if Luffy was entering the final stretch of the new world, facing emperors, it was logical to think that sooner or later he would have to reach that level. Additionally, narratively, it made sense. If Luffy is going to defeat Kaido, he needed a qualitative leap, not just more power, but something that changed the rules of the fight. What's interesting is that within this theory there were many variants. Some said the awakening would have no name, that it would simply be a passive improvement. Others thought Gear 5th would be one thing and the awakening would come later. There was even someone who believed Oda would save the awakening for the final confrontation with the world government. But there was a group that insisted Gear 5th and the awakening would be the same thing. That Gear 5th would not simply be another mode, but the maximum point of the story. And finally, that's what happened. When Luffy falls defeated by Kaido and his heart starts beating in a strange way, the awakening activates, and that activation is what gives rise to Gear 5th. It wasn't a separate power-up, it was literally the fruit awakening. That said, no one anticipated exactly what form it would take. No one expected the Nika twist. No one knew the fruit wasn't simply the Gumu Gumu no Mi. No one imagined the awakening would bring that exaggerated, free cartoon style. But the basic structure of the theory, the fact that Gear 5th would be the awakening, was fulfilled. And that's what makes it so interesting, because it proves that even though the specific detail was impossible to predict, the narrative framework could be intuited. Oda had spent arcs teaching us what an awakening was, showed us how it worked, taught us it was the natural next step. And when the key moment arrived, Luffy reached that level. Personally, I think it was well constructed. It wasn't something pulled from nowhere. It was the logical culmination of something that had been preparing for a long time. The form, on the other hand, was unexpected, but the base of the theory was exactly right. Theory number 25. Loki had the fruit of a dragon. And on top of that, one that was confirmed just recently, completely fresh. For a long time, people discussed what Loki's fruit would be. From the moment the character appeared, he generated insane hype. Powerful design, strong presence, a strange aura, and then that flashback, which, being honest, is one of the most impactful we've had recently. People went crazy over Loki. We knew several things. That he had eaten a mysterious fruit, that it was a legendary fruit from the territory of Elbaf, and that it had a special importance within giant culture. This already opened the door to enormous theories, and as always, the fandom worked its magic. There was everything. Theories about Norse gods, theories about mythological creatures, theories about ancient weapons, even stranger ideas mixing concepts from the Void Century. But there was one specific theory that gained a lot of traction. That Loki had the fruit of a dragon. Where did this come from? Mainly from visual details. There was a color spread that Oda did not too long ago where a gigantic dragon appeared flying alongside Luffy and company. And that dragon had one very specific detail. It was sticking its tongue out in a very characteristic way, exactly the same as Loki in his first presentation. When that exaggerated expression appears, tongue out, proclaiming grandiose things about being the destroyer of the world or the sun god, that visual parallel didn't go unnoticed. And it's not the first time Oda uses color spreads to give us clues. Sometimes they're just pretty illustrations, but other times he hides symbolism, winks that with time start to make sense. So when people saw that dragon with such a specific attitude, many said, this can't be coincidence. Furthermore, if we're talking about Elbaf, we're talking about a land associated with mythology, ancestral power, enormous creatures. A dragon fits perfectly within that imagery. And if Loki was going to be such an important character, his fruit had to be on the same level. Finally, in the Elbaf arc, it's confirmed, Loki has the fruit of a dragon. And not just any small or stylized dragon. He transforms into a colossal, gargantuan dragon, a massive creature that commands respect with its presence alone, visually brutal, narratively powerful. And at that moment, the theory was validated. What's interesting is that, once again, this wasn't an impossible deduction based on secret data. It was about observing visual patterns, understanding how Oda builds his clues, and connecting apparently small details. What I like most about this confirmation is that it reinforces something that always comes up in One Piece. Oda plants things in places where many don't look. The color spreads, the cover pages, the small visual parallels, everything can mean something. And now that we know this theory was true, it makes you want to go back and review other old illustrations to see if there are more hidden clues waiting to be understood. Personally, I find Loki's dragon form spectacular. It's a fruit that fits perfectly with his character and with the scale he needed to have as a character. Now we just need to see the official colors and, above all, the animated adaptation. Because if the manga already imposes, in motion it could be absolutely incredible. And so we close with a theory that went from being a visual suspicion to becoming a full-on giant dragon. And that's it for this video of 25 theories that turned out to be correct in One Piece. I would love it if in the comments you let me know which of all these 25 theories was your favorite. If there's one I haven't mentioned, leave it in the comments. And if you enjoyed it, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.